testosterone, we have a problem.
This is Outside the Manosphere, where two guys with zero credentials dive past the cliches of masculinity and try to become better friends by actually talking to each other. It's weirdly hard, but we're doing it anyway. Join us.
Welcome to Outside the Manosphere. I'm Skip.
And I'm Carlos.
How you doing this week, Carlos?
I'm waking up, but I'm all right. This week's been good. What about you?
Yeah, pretty good week. I had my last physical therapy, which was dope. I feel like I was graduating from sciatica pain to shoulder pain. But I feel confident that like my sciatica is getting better, and I've had shoulder issues before. So I'm in a pretty happy place. Yeah.
You can deal with the shoulder stuff. The rump pain is an issue.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to burn through kind of our each news item that we're bringing to the table before we jump right back into our interview with Dr. Pete. So I've got nothing at the moment. What are you thinking right now, Skip?
So mine is something, and it's actually not a news item. It's something called Goodhart's Law, and it comes from economics originally. And it's something that I see in the world all the time and actually like applies sort of to the interview that we had released last week with Dr. Pete about traditional masculinity and this rigidity and stuff. And Goodhart's Law is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And like in layman's terms, what this means is like if you're trying to like teach kids, right? So this is just an example that from teaching. And the goal is to get a good grade. Then kids will use ChatGPT to get a good grade. And that's no longer a good measure of them actually learning.
Okay.
So measures, we tend to find we make measures to like measure something that's hard to get at. So like learning is a really hard thing to measure, for instance. So we do things like grades. And then the grades become the thing that's actually the target for kids rather than learning. So it ceases to be a good measure because kids find a way to get to that target without doing the thing that we're trying to measure.
Right.
And we see this like all the time in life. And I was thinking about it in relation to masculinity, as we talked about it last week, in traditional masculinity. And part of the idea of masculinity, like Dr. Pete smartly said, most people aren't just walking around thinking about masculinity all the time. But like there are guys that do make this into their whole identity, and it's like a target so that they can be successful. But like success is something that you feel internally. It's something that makes you happy. It's something that makes you socially fulfilled and all these things. And when the measure is this external thing that's built by the manosphere of what masculinity looks like, and you're trying to do it and you can't, whether you can't meet it or you meet it, but you're still kind of miserable or whatever, that target ceases to be a good measure of the goal, which is like happiness and fulfillment. So like Goodhart's Law, when you kind of learn to see what it is, where it's just like, we're trying to measure something that's a little bit fuzzy. And soon people are like, okay, this is how they're measuring it. So I'm going to get to this. I'm going to make that the target. I'm going to make like scoring well on this thing the target rather than the thing it's actually trying to get, which is like learning or developing or whatever.
Okay.
And that happens with economics a lot too. So another like quick example is like GDP. GDP is a really good example. It's a measure of economic health. But like if some company like NVIDIA is making all of the growth in the stock market and the rest of the stock market isn't moving, then like, is it really a good measure that the stock market is improving if it's just based on this one company? Or is it even really is the stock market even really a good measure of economics if people are having a hard time putting food on their table?
Right.
So like those are all these kind of examples of like the target is a healthy economy, but the actual measure we're using as the target is something else entirely that's like a little fuzzy. And when we start to look at that as the goal, everything gets kind of messed up. So like I see it all the time and I love it and I'm hoping to bring it up in the future, which is why I want to introduce it now.
You know what?
Yeah.
I would love for you to bring it up in the future because I'm still wrapping my mind around it. But it sounds really, really interesting. And I'm curious, like, specifically with the economy, which isn't Manosphere related
Right.
necessarily, but I'm curious what your thoughts on a solution would be. And we should not get into it right now because we've got a whole second half of an interview to get to. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in talking about this a little bit more because it's a new concept. Well, it's not exactly a new concept, but it sounds like it's been unpacked and put on display. So I'm curious what you've come across. You'll link that to for everyone, yeah.
Goodhart's Law? Yeah. I'll just link like the Wikipedia description.
Okay. Sure. Okay. I don't have any kind of in-depth news whatsoever. All I'm going to do for this section here is give a little synchronicity that we just heard this morning, which I found interesting because I popped my phone open just now. I'm like, I got to have some news and I don't have anything. And I landed on the picture you sent me of a bedspread and pillow that you're going to buy for your son's birthday.
Yeah.
Of the periodic tables, which I thought is wonderfully Skip thing to do. But the synchronicity is that I'd say closer to last night rather than yesterday, I kind of impulsively ordered a 1,000-piece puzzle of the periodic tables. So, and here we are in the morning, you sending me a bedspread and pillow case of the periodic table for your son. So yeah, that's a little bit of synchronicity news, kind of.
Well, and I think the real takeaway is that we're both incredibly cool.
Yeah, that's well, you know what? In my defense, I've never taken a chemistry class, and I guess it's not really a defense because it's still not making me any cooler. But I've never taken a chemistry class. Like I told you before, I didn't make it through high school, and in college and university, I just pick up other sciences. So I don't know the periodic tables, and I'm like, what a good way to learn them by staring at them for hours while trying to put a puzzle together. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, my little news item is not even remotely as sophisticated as yours, but hey, I'm beautiful, and that's what counts.
You're a beautiful man.
All right, well, should we jump into this second half of this interview with Dr. Peter Fisher?
Yes, let's do it. This is Dr. Peter Fisher. He's a research fellow with the Movember Institute for Men's Health, and we will be talking about the real face of Men's Health report.
I'll wait for Skip to get his headphones on here. I was just thinking, I said mid-40s, but really, Skip, if we're being pedantic here, one of us is in their late 40s.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Yes. Well, I'm just going to move past that. So, Pete, I think just like a very non-rigid kind of roadmap for where we might like to go from here. And like I said, non-rigid because we like tangents and things like that. But I wanted to maybe start off, we've been talking all around social connection but we haven't actually talked about why it's important, even though we all kind of acknowledge that it's important, and like what happens if you don't have it, and kind of getting into that first section of the report. So why is it important? What happens when it's not there? That's our basic question for you.
Absolutely. And it was one of the basic questions that led us to include that in the report. And I think, for context here, the report had a large focus on premature mortality, right? And that was one of the driving forces for the Real Face report in the US and also the other markets, is to kind of show that at a baseline level, men are dying too young, right? And this is particularly true in the US, right? Where 53% of men are dying before age 75. And then the rest of the report kind of dives into the different factors that are leading to this premature mortality and this kind of like men's poor health. And so when it comes to social connection, we know that this has been an issue going back for years. And in fact, the US Surgeon General in 2023 declared loneliness and isolation an epidemic, which is basically acknowledging that it's a public health imperative that needs to be addressed at the same level as things like cancer rates and things like that. And to connect those two, loneliness is linked to increased risk of premature mortality to the point where high rates of loneliness can be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
That's wild.
In terms of negative health impact. So that's comparable to obesity and inactivity in terms of physical health and physical health markers and premature mortality risk. So that's the context, right? And so what we wanted to do is kind of dive deeper and look at like what in the US is the particular makeup of these issues around social connection, what's leading to this, and kind of how are men faring. And what we found is really striking, where 25% of US men aged 15 to 34 said that they felt lonely the previous day. So that's a quarter of young men feeling lonely, and that's 7% above the national average for both men and women. So incredibly high, and it's much higher than the rates in all the other OECD countries. And part of why that's happening is going back to our earlier conversation around socialization, around emotional conversations. There was a Pew study in 2025 that found that when asked about like who do you lean on, and do you lean on friends in times of need, only 38% of men said they do, versus 54% of women. And so under 40% of men are actually like reaching out to friends when they're going through a hard time. And that's a very fundamental kind of part of social connection, is having people to help you through difficult times. And again, this is not vilifying men for doing this. There's a lot of other things, societal factors, social norm factors that we've talked about that are structural, that have led to men feeling like they can't do these things. And so the report paints this really striking picture of kind of what that looks like. And so, another piece of this is obviously a hot topic, and that there's, this idea of like social media being one of the driving factors of this social disconnection. And there's absolutely the acknowledgement that digital platforms have normalized kind of just passive consumption rather than proactive, like connective things, which is very ironic given the name and origins of social media, is that it's pretty antisocial, it turns out, when it comes to fostering connection in most cases. And so in the Surgeon General's report back in 2023, they also warned that digital connections don't really have the same kind of protective power when it comes to mental health as in-person relationships. And that's, our earlier conversation alluded to that, where, in the pandemic, I was on Discord a lot, but we were playing video games. It was like the conversations were not the same as like meeting a friend for coffee or meeting a friend for dinner, And so it took me a lot of like awareness, recognition, and like kind of unlearning and then learning new skills to even get those digital conversations to the same point as my in-person conversation. So it's really just a different landscape. And ultimately, social media is kind of taking away space and time, and the fact that more and more people, and in particular young men, are moving on to social media for connecting with friends means that that's actively taken away from time that they could be doing that in person. And that in-person time has been shown to be more protective to mental health in particular.
Yeah, we've probably all seen and even participated in like the table full of people that are all staring at their phones rather than talking to the people that are right in front of them. You see it all the time when you just walk around. It's pretty hard to escape that gravity well of attention. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's not to not to cast blame on people for spending too much time on their phone. I think we have to acknowledge that smartphones are designed by companies who have hired people to keep you using them at all times, and all of the apps. And there's so much incentive around engagement and content and endless scrolling, and all of these things are designed to capture attention. And so it can be really tough to build in-person social connection in a world that's dominated by advanced technology and a lot of resources dedicated to keeping you on these devices. So yeah, I think a lot of people are like navigating these pressures, because the phone can also be a source of connection, but those incentives are actually kind of pushing people away from that meaningful connection in terms of the technology.
I wanted to circle back around to something and ask you about it. You'd said that like young men in particular had felt lonely the previous day. And then I was noticing in the report that also women that were like the next cohort older were also feeling, and there was a couple things that I was wondering about. One was, how are those two related? And the second was, is because we've talked about like these masculinity norms and what we don't want to say, and some of these things are self-reporting. How likely do you think it is that older men also are lonely, but they're not saying it?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it really demonstrates that there are different kind of thresholds for what different generations of men consider to be lonely, where it's like, oh, I caught up with my friend Steve 2 months ago I'm fulfilled. That can be it, right? Where this is younger generations where it's like, oh, I haven't talked to anybody in like a day or two. That can make you feel. And so it's like, absolutely, it's kind of there's moving goalposts for different standards. And that's not to say that those different thresholds are all equally like valid. I think there's definitely, a baseline that you need to have for meaningful social connection. But I do think that, yeah, there's definitely different degrees of socialization around what that social connection, frequency and depth of that connection looks like. And that's part of the, again, like masculinity is a very high level identity. There's many other identities like age and, race, things that come into play there. But yeah, I think the fact that this is such a cross-cutting finding of this loneliness is very interesting. And I think, yeah, it's the fact that women are experiencing it as well. I think it's showing that it's a societal issue. It's not just tied to men. But that being said, I think, Movember's approach for men's health is that, when men are healthier, everybody benefits. The men, the people that in their communities and the people that they have relationships with. I think so. There's like a give and take, right? Where if men are disconnected, it's likely that that's affecting women as well. Because if men aren't able to like create and foster these meaningful social connections, a lot of those would be with women who are not having those. And so, and again, it kind of like there's like a push and pull of like, even if women are feeling very connected socially and have the skills to like have these emotional conversations and bring that emotional depth and get the fulfillment out of their social connections, if men aren't able to kind of reach that same kind of level of social connection, that can be
reciprocate. Yeah.
It's funny that I had seen that 1 in 4 men or have experienced loneliness, and I forget the figure now, but it was something like 15 to 30% higher since 2014 or something like that. The funny thing is, I kind of took it as like, well, I saw it as a negative net, but also as like, well, maybe there's something positive there that like more people are comfortable enough with their own masculinity to report loneliness. You know what I'm saying? I am feeling lonely. So I wonder what it would have been like. I don't know, 25 years ago, how that would have, if it would have been much higher than 38% or right around the same.
No, it's a great point. And again, I think, yeah, the shifting societal norms around like expectations for what it means to be lonely are important. And I think there has been more opening up of those norms. Like, think about the Marlboro Man and that idea of masculinity from like the 50s, 60s, and this idea that you don't not needing anybody. It's like loneliness doesn't even factor into that, right? Where it's like, so, and now it's like the recognition that it's like, oh, you need a robust friend group and like social network to both have like protective factors for mental health, but also just to like have a social life, to like feel connected, feel purpose, like having community. These are all like very tied back to very fundamental psychological needs of like belonging and connection in terms of connection to a place, to a community, to, a hobby, to an activity that you find meaningful and gives you purpose. So yeah, so many things, right? Where it's like, you can't do it alone a lot of the time. And that's what it comes down to. But yeah, I think it was really striking. I think the fact that in the US, it was kind of maybe accelerated compared to the rest of the OECD is, I think, tied to a lot of the other factors that we're seeing in the societal level. I think there's a lot of, partisanship, and there's different echo chambers that can lead to like feeling like there are certain topics that you can't bring up with certain people based on identities. I think that's all overall harmful. It's like it creates a chilling effect on having conversations around things that we really should be having conversations around, not just mental health, but also like societal things. And I think in that climate, it can be really difficult to want to meet new people and meet new friends, especially folks with different identities and stuff. And so just acknowledging again that there's like, societal factors that are compounding this and leading to this kind of rising rates of loneliness.
I think, not on a masculinity bend, but just like in the US, it's so much easier to isolate. It's so much harder to make connections, just because like thinking about like my day-to-day life here in the Czech Republic, I live in a building where I see my neighbors, and we at least have to say hi. I'm on a tram with people. Like when you're in the US, even if those interactions aren't deep or anything, you're still reminded constantly that other people are there. Whereas when I'm in the US, like you'll have a big house to yourself with a yard, and like it's very easy to like close your windows and kind of not see the rest of the world, and you get in a car and you're by yourself, and you start to see, like with road rage, these are not human beings, these are like other obstacles in the road. And so like just the way the society is set up, I think makes it also very, very difficult in some ways, in a uniquely American kind of way.
Well, I'll add to that though, like living in rural Canada right now,
Yeah.
or for the foreseeable future. I find that, I mean, everyone knows everyone here for the most part, except for us because we're not from here. But I found that like even expressing kindness and like friendliness to people, like a shop clerk, I don't know, like I can just feel the loneliness coming off of them because they kind of glom onto that like cheer. And
Mhm.
it's the same sort of like, I don't know, despondency that I think there's all around the world. It's just you can't escape it, whether you're rural or metropolitan or in a sprawling city like Los Angeles. It's just, I don't know. The human condition,
Mhm.
I guess, is really is really what it is.
It's so true. And I think, to put my cultural psychologist hat on for a second, I think there's this notion in cultural psychology about the cultural makeup of different countries and societies. And one of the major kind of threads that folks have identified is this notion of, like, at a very high level, is the country more independent or interdependent? And the US is an outlier in terms of independence, to the degree where it's like makes research done on this topic in the US like impossible to apply to other countries, because and there's so many different layers of how this is implemented into society. Even the idea of like suburbs, of like moving a family to a place and then being disconnected from your professional life, from like urban centers, and having even the way houses are designed of like, oh, you need a movie theater in your house so you don't have to, or like you need a game room so you don't have to go to a space to do it. It's like, or a pool, you know, you're like building in these
Yeah.
public figures into a place where, so you don't have to leave and engage with other people. So the independent thing, it's like high level, but the way it manifests in US society is like very concrete, and there's structures, and even like at a urban planning level, ways that are designed to kind of cater to this desire for independence. And even the idea of like living alone in the US, I think seeing that as a rite of passage as an adult.
Mhm.
A lot of other countries, not even an expectation. You live with your parents until you get married, right? And in the US, it's like, oh, you haven't lived alone. Like it's this whole thing, and it's so interesting where it's like, and again, this is compounded through the lens of masculinity, where men are in an independent society in the US, and then they also have this pressures of feeling independent by US standards as a man. And so it's like acknowledging from a cultural perspective, it's like a lot of people don't feel that pressure to be
Mhm.
that extreme level of independence in other societies. And so, and again, that's reflected, like, for example, in Spain, like plaza culture, the idea that there's like public gathering spaces where you run into neighbors, run into friends, you do meetups. And that's like, we think about social connection in the US, where it's like we don't really have third spaces like that outside of certain major metro areas where there's like really well designed parks and things. But the plaza culture, the coffee shop culture, it's like a little more dispersed, it's a little smaller. People are like making plans to meet up there rather than just going there as like a daily routine. And so the whole fabric of like kind of how a society is interpreting like the role of the individual, either as to be an independent entity versus more interdependent with their family unit and the like rest of their community, really changes a lot of things. And like more interdependent countries, like in Southeast Asia, for example, you know, there's things around like etiquette and like just putting the needs of the group before yourself and things like that. And that's like kind of a foreign idea to a lot of Americans, where it's like, you know, it's like, oh, I'm putting my needs first. And that's kind of a grounding. And so that's all to point out that these are like very high level cultural ideas, but the manifestations have real impacts, like both on
Yeah.
urban planning and like where we live, how we live, and also on the things that we talk about in the report, like social connection. And so that's why it's important for us at Movember to do these reports in our different markets. And this was the first time we did it in the US, and we're able to call out a lot of those like kind of unique factors about what the landscape of the US looks like and how that is contributing to things like premature mortality and social connection.
Sounds like a great chance to segue into. I had a question about Movember's Making Connections initiative. And then right into that second part, which is all of these things making a difference and the ways to kind of overcome this and or the reorganization, essentially. I'd love to hear more about that because we don't know.
And this is the hard part. This is where the rubber meets the road, where it's like you can do all of the great descriptive research in the world and you're laying out the problem space and the issues, but none of that matters if you're not also trying to take a stab at what solutions to these things could look like. And so yeah, we're really proud that the report did both, where it was kind of like, here's the US's situation, and then here's approaches that are, some of them have already started in the US, the state level, community level. And we also took inspiration from federal level men's health frameworks. For example, the UK and Australia both just implemented national men's health policy frameworks where it's going to be at the federal level kind of mandated gender responsive healthcare approach and like dedicated funds to addressing these issues through a like men's health lens, which is incredible. So a lot of great models out there, but of course, thinking about the US and our unique kind of socio-political landscape, there might be different approaches that might be more effective here, especially in the near term. But to take it back to what Movember has already been doing in this space, so the Making Connections program launched over a decade ago now. And that's kind of how we partnered with different community organizations in places like barbershops and local sports teams and community centers and kind of like different under-resourced communities to and schools as well to kind of meet men and boys where they already are. And it was building in kind of this layer into the art programming that was already happening in those spaces. So like sports clubs or hobby groups or meetups at community centers. And it was building in this layer of kind of social connection and mental health training and just creating essentially kind of like spaces within the spaces that already exist to have these conversations that maybe weren't happening. And so that's led to some really interesting breakthroughs and understanding of these norms. And the coolest part, I think, for me as a cultural psychologist is that because we were tailoring these spaces to these, unique communities, it was really responsive to kind of the needs of those communities where we would, create these facilitation guides for folks to have these conversations and folks would tell us, hey, this doesn't make sense. And so we'd work with them to kind of change, how would you talk about this? How does that get brought up in your community? And what does it look like to do that? And so it was really this kind of like, rather than a one size fits all, it was really tailoring these approaches. And again, it was all in service of creating spaces where people could feel like they could foster connection. And a lot of times it was where they were already seeking that out. And it was just like an extra layer to really solidify it and build it out and expand it. And so that's been really successful. We've recently parlayed that program into a couple other interesting initiatives, including one called Sport as Engagement, where it's a really interesting model of like train the trainer, where it's like folks who have gone through like Making Connections in the past, then come back and get trained to this model of this kind of mental health layer to coaching and training where, they're doing a basketball clinic and then they have like a team huddle and they're like, what is it like? How do you feel after you lose? Like, what do you do when you are dealing with feelings of loss and grief and anger? And how do you work through that? And it's done in this way where it's like aligned with kind of the reason that a lot of these boys and young men are there to get better at a sport and to have community, but it's also building in these like very fundamental, like emotional, like regulation skills and social connection skills. And what I love as a psychologist is that it's norming these things, right? Where it's like, this is a space where you talk about these things. And then the trainers who have gone through this program are the perfect kind of people to be administrating it, because rather than having me come in, some stranger, in a lab coat, essentially, right, of telling them this is how you should be doing this, it's folks who have done it and are from their community who are telling them. And so it's like the near peer role model, this idea of somebody who's like seen as like almost an equal, but maybe is a little older, maybe a little more experienced, kind of telling you how things are done, is a great kind of way to deliver these really responsive messages around social connection and things. So we're really proud of that. That's currently under the first year of that is just completed. So we're doing a program evaluation of kind of the initial trials, and then we're going to be scaling that up to create that at a framework level, which is really cool. And so that's, I think, if I could call that out as like one thing that we're already doing that's exciting in this space, you got to take your wins, and not just to dwell on the like kind of dire statistics around social connection, but there's also very exciting things happening at the community level, and Movember's been integral into those. But the second part of your question was about the policy level thing, right? So there's a lot of stuff out there that's doing really great work in this space. And I want to call it one other Movember thing that's actually just underway. That's actually, I think, really relevant to the conversation we've had both around social connection, social media, and kind of like the online space. It's called the Young Men Media Collective. It's a Movember program being run out of our team in the UK. And it's basically funding and working with content creators to create alternative narratives around masculinity and men's health in online spaces to really challenge some of the existing narratives out there that aren't the most adaptive for fostering good health and social connection. And so what's really cool is that's kind of like an accelerator program where it's like amplifying certain voices and narratives, and it's selective across different markets. So there's a couple in the US, a couple in the UK, a couple in Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. And it's kind of like a trial run for what this approach could look like. So really interesting stuff happening there. And it's working with folks who are across the different spheres. So it's other nonprofits, other like small YouTubers and things to kind of like scale up and build in some layering of like learning from what we've learned at Movember and kind of facilitating that. But again, these are people already doing this work in the space. So that's some really exciting stuff. And that's one thing that Movember is doing, is like recognizing that, you know, if people are spending, especially young men, are spending a lot of time on social media, it's important to understand and create narratives in that space that men can find, that men can essentially, when men are searching those terms like, how do I make friends? How do I get a girlfriend? How do I, be successful? Making more answers to those questions that are grounded in evidence, that are grounded in ways that are healthy to the individual and to the community, rather than silver bullet ideas that are designed to make money for masculine influencers, right? So that's kind of one of the exciting things that Movember is doing right now. But I think in terms of policy, in the US, we focused a lot on the state level because I think there's a lot of interesting examples of what can be done at the state level. And I think, recently, for example, Gavin Newsom made a proclamation in California that like young men's mental health and suicide prevention was going to be a priority, and acknowledging kind of the gendered lens of the crisis around those things. And so that was cool to get, largest state in the country to kind of acknowledge that there are issues around these things and be bringing that policy framework mindset to it. And so some of the things that we found and recommend for tackling issues of social connection and men's early, premature mortality is creating offices, commissions, task forces at the state level, partnering them with existing kind of public health resources, and really just staffing and resourcing groups that are focused on men's health in particular. And this really starts with measurement. So setting measurable goals, tracking these public health issues through a gendered lens. So looking at not just tracking gender, but like breaking it down by gender and looking at how where there are gaps by gender and things, and acknowledging that there's like different approaches are needed for men and women across some of those gaps. That's really what the data is telling us. And then using, data at the like local level to kind of drive these conversations. I think another one is kind of like the coordinated care approach is really important, where it's acknowledging that it's a multifaceted issue around premature mortality. So this can be like, at the state level, it's acknowledging that housing and employment are both things that are driving men's poor health when men don't have those things. And so it's building up robust kind of housing programs, acknowledging fatherhood. There aren't a ton of like state-sponsored father resources, but there are a decent amount of like other ones. And so I think there's acknowledging some of the gaps that are existing. And then there's also some exciting stuff. And the last thing I'll plug from Movember for this section is that we rolled out this cool framework in Australia called Men in Mind, which is basically a set of clinical guidelines for mental health practitioners who work with men to bring that gender responsive lens, acknowledging that men, when they talk about depression, they're not going to say, I'm depressed. They might say, I'm feeling burnt out. And acknowledging that there's like different framings and ways that men are bringing up these things that are unique to men. And so we want to scale that up and bring that to the US and kind of roll that out and hopefully get adoption from like the state level or the national level for adopting these guidelines for working with men. And again, the through thread there is the gender responsive approach of just acknowledging that, look, there are gaps on social connection that are driven by like men experiencing higher rates of social disconnection. So like, how do we then tell clinicians and the folks who are dealing with the issues that this creates, how do we empower them to address those things in particular? Because again, bringing kind of the one size fits all approach to this, it just has not been working. And so bringing an approach that is informed by the latest evidence, that is acknowledging men's unique kind of issues and the things that they're navigating can only be a benefit. And so that's early days, but we're hoping to kind of get some buy-in from the, psychological organizations in the US, and then parlay that into working with governors and, state senators, to kind of get some movement on the policy level in the US. Because ultimately that's where things, when you
Right.
are getting things enshrined as policy, as legislation, that's the permanent structure, that's structural change. And that's like one of our main goals of Movember.
So that's really neat. Like when you're talking about approaching men's health or health with men differently, it sort of brings it back to what Carlos was saying earlier. It's like it's a bit of code switching based on gender with how you're interacting with the genders. I also wanted to just shout out Movember. Like if you've ever donated to Movember, this is where the money's going, and it's seems like a great use to me. And if you haven't, then not now, but maybe, well, now I'm sure they'd be happy to take it. But definitely in November when it comes around, donate again to Movember, and we'll be on that too. I wanted to ask one more thing, kind of like in that same in vein, where you were talking about sports teams and like coaches that are already in those spaces being really good people to talk and norm some more healthy masculine behavior. One of the state programs that kind of caught my eye because as a teacher was one in Connecticut where they're trying to get more male teachers, which I thought was really interesting because it's the kind of things that we've been doing for a long time or talking about for a long time with minorities as well, and getting minorities represented in classrooms because there's just such a differential response for students based on seeing people that look like them. And that I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that and carrying forward into that kind of space,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, like I mentioned with the sports engagement, the kind of next step of making connections program, that near peer role model is so important for men to have kind of a template for what it looks like to, be a good guy. And I think that starts really young with educators, especially in like primary education. And, Richard Reeves and the American Institute for Boys and Men has written about this extensively, about the need for more male teachers. And I think they're actually even starting up new initiatives around funding that and working at the state level to make that happen. I think that's awesome. And I think, yeah, again, that's like one, and I think positive male role models, more of those can only be a good thing, right? Where it's like, especially when it's in person rather than, because I think ultimately that's why a lot of young men are going online, is that they feel like they don't have that, or they feel that the folks that they do have in their lives, that information might be outdated, right? Or not up to speed with what current trends are. And so having folks who are maybe a little closer to them in age, are maybe a little more relatable than say a parent, right? It's important, right? It's just feeling this need for, it's like, I want a template for what this looks like for me, that's responsive to what my needs are. And if they're not finding that in real life, they're going to be looking online, right? And so I think the more that can happen in education settings is great. In sports settings with coaches and trainers and mentors, even senior teammates, this idea of having folks who are in close proximity, who you're seeing on a regular basis, and have that kind of mentorship connection is so important, right? Where that's like, that can be a relationship where you can open up about what you're not good at and what you want to get better at, and have conversations around that. And when the mentor or educator or in that position is responsive to those needs and is helping, people, and is really modeling what it means to do that. They're not just saying, oh, just like man up, or whatever. They're actually like doing the work of being like, yeah, like let's unpack it. Like, what are your insecurities? Like, how do we get there? What's worked? And I think that's great. And it can absolutely be one of the pieces of the puzzle. I think, again, that's only one side of it. And the issue is that like men need to feel like they can engage with those people as like the resources that they are. And so I think there's work that needs to happen to create contexts where, men and young boys and students feel comfortable engaging their teachers on that, and that teachers have that. And I think at a curriculum level, that's absolutely something that should be part of, it was funny, like my high school didn't have a health class. We had image. And I always thought that was like a silly, but I think that's actually pretty aligned with what I'm talking about, which is this idea of like, what does health look like, and like, it can look like many different things. And so having role models who are able to speak to that and speak to that effectively and create spaces where those conversations can happen is super important. And when it's, a guy doing that and creating that space, it changes that expectation that may have been socialized into young men that only women can lead emotional conversations, right? And all of a sudden that's turned on its head when it's like, a male teacher or a mentor or coach who is now the one starting this. And so again, yeah, it can shift the norms. It can help kind of break down some of these societal expectations that it's like, oh, only these kind of people can do that. It's like, no, it's like people who look like you can do that. People who are in positions that you want to be in one day are doing this. And so I think that's so important. That's really the power of having more of those male role models. But again, it's not as simple as like, oh, just hire more teachers. It's like teachers are underpaid. There's stigma around these jobs, and men in care or care adjacent or even teaching positions can be stigmatized. And so there's a lot of work at the societal level to adequately fund these positions, especially in public education. And also to, break down the taboo that a male teacher is like, that's like male nursing, the idea that people in care positions are somehow like less masculine. And so I think there's like work that needs to happen around motivating men to engage in those professions as well. So yeah, definitely a broader conversation to be had there for sure.
Well, I'll say as always with Movember, when we first started, when Skip reached out to you guys last year, I wasn't, one thing that I was not expecting from this entire endeavor was experiencing hope. And both times we've spoken, I'm like, wow, there's the wheels are turning in the background, and it is not all doom and gloom, and there are solutions on the horizon. And it's been a really, really positive 2 conversations now we've had with you. And yeah, I hope we have some more. I do have some more questions. It's just it's a winding path. Maybe we can have another conversation about the real face of men's health with you if you're willing.
Absolutely, Carlos. Yeah. And it's been a pleasure to share this platform and engage with folks in the space. I mean, I think about it as, we want to walk the walk when it comes to being strengths-based. And part of that is like, we put out this report to kind of, raise the awareness and raise the profile of men's health. But I mean this when I say this, that I think all of the issues that we raise in the report are things that can be tackled in the next 10 years. I think these are things that, if we dedicate resources and time and attention in a thoughtful way, we can really change these statistics. And I think there's multiple angles of attack. And we talked about some of the policy ones, but there's also community orgs, individual employers, philanthropists. Doesn't take many billionaires to make a difference if they decide to prioritize this issue. So yeah, and Movember's really positioned ourselves as kind of like, we want to be facilitators and change agents in this space where we want to bring people together and recognize that this is something that's going to take more than one group to address. And appreciate you appreciating us. And it's really, yeah, I mean, I can't say enough good things about the research team at Movember, the most dedicated, passionate group of folks who are in it to, yeah, everybody kind of has a personal connection to Movember in ways that, range from having experienced, suicide and loss or cancer diagnoses and among men and their families, or even just like having relationships with family members that they wish were different. And I mean, it doesn't have to be, a huge diagnosis to change how you think about these things. I think, everybody has their own journey, and Movember wants to acknowledge that. But yeah, thank you guys. This has been a great conversation. Been really enjoying everything we've been talking about.
I really enjoyed these conversations. And I wanted to shout out this report again, the Real Face of Men's Health report, because it is put together in a really readable manner. There's really good visual presentations of data. There's also narratives, which helps people kind of digest some of this stuff. So I think it's a really smartly constructed document that I'm going to enjoy kind of diving into more in the future, hopefully. And there's things that, even in the sections that we've talked about, we didn't get to talk about some of the cut hypertension program in California. The results around that are just amazing. Like when these programs that you're kind of shouting out and talking about are effective, man, they are really effective. And it's very cool to kind of see some of the stories and the numbers. And we really appreciate you coming on to give us a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Skip. Okay. And I should say, it's a dense report. It's 120 pages. And so there's an
Yeah.
executive summary. There's also like a data visualization kind of walkthrough on the webpage as well. And so if you just Google Movember Real Face and Men's Health Report US, it'll come up, and there's a whole page where you've got the top line bullet points. You can go deeper into specific sections without having to go kind of wade through the whole report. The executive summary has the top line takeaways, and the little data like walkthrough visualization kind of takes you through that in a more visual way. So there's different approaches. Choose your own adventure, however deep you want to go. And again, it speaks to each of the things that we bring up in the report are so multifaceted. There's so many different factors leading in and outputs and possible solutions. And so we just wanted to really create like a snapshot of what that looks like in the US right now. And yeah, more to come on that front. And it's going to really, again, be kind of the bedrock for a lot of the really interesting projects that we're doing. And I'm excited to share more about those in the future.
Yeah, and I was curious to get into, and maybe we'll save it for another time. There's programs with Native Americans and Latinos and Hawaiians and African Americans in different spaces that it brings up intersectionality and like the interest there. So I'm interested in having that conversation in the future. But one thing you did mention just towards the end, if we're wrapping up, is people wishing just that somebody in their life or a relation or a friend was a little bit different. If you see someone sliding into kind of a really unhealthy version of masculinity, what is the recommendation there? Like, is it just talk to them and connect, or sometimes that can be a little hard?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so what's your professional diagnosis?
Well, this is a great question. I mean, there's entire organizations who are trying to create these approaches for helping guys. They call them like off-ramping from the manosphere, essentially, or creating alternatives to fulfilling the same needs that they would be getting from engaging with that content. I think ultimately the most basic one is just check in more frequently. I think, like we talked about, the reason a lot of guys are going into those spaces in the first place is because they feel like that's the only avenue they have to get answers to these questions. And so if they're getting those answers or the fulfillment of certain psychological needs from, in-person connection, it will preempt them going into those spaces and engaging with it. But if somebody's already kind of on that path, have real like candid conversations around like, hey, like, do you believe everything they're saying? I think there's a lot of rationalization that happens when especially young men are getting into it, is that they feel like their peers are also buying into it, again, with the normist perception where, and again, this is part of the tactic of these masculine influencers, is that they are dominating a conversation. And there's interesting research on social media where it's like, we know that a small number of people are creating the most content. And this is absolutely true of the masculine influencer space, where it's like a few voices are really pushing these narratives very hard. And then when you can kind of point that out and be like, hey, like, I don't agree with this, like this, and I don't think a lot of people do. That can be enough to kind of pop the bubble of like, oh, like I thought this was like the way to do it, And again, circling full circle back to the multiple masculinities piece is just this idea that I think a lot of guys get caught up with finding the formula, cracking the code on like being a successful guy, being a wealthy or, powerful guy. And it's really encouraging folks to kind of critically engage with those notions about like, there's a lot of possible versions of your future self. And it's like, what do you want that to look like? And is that going to be something that's going to be fulfilled by following the advice that you're getting from these people? Or is that going to be something that's actually taking you further away from those things? And so those are obviously big topics and can be kind of heavy to engage with. But I think it really does start with, checking in on folks, being like, hey, how are you feeling? Like, acknowledging big events that are happening in folks' lives. If I think, men who are at greater risk of entering those narratives is like post-breakup, there's a lot of like issues around mental health and suicidality, around relationship breakdown. Michael Wilson, who's another research fellow at Movember, just did a great systematic review paper of looking at kind of how relationship breakdown is a major cause of like suicidal ideation among certain men. And so it's really recognizing when like the guys in your life are going through things that could kind of lead them into those spaces. And then once they're already starting to engage with that content, it's really just being candid about like sharing your opinion, be like, I don't know if I agree with that. And then kind of challenging folks. Cause I think a lot of it can get brought up and then people brush it aside or don't engage because it doesn't feel comfortable, but really challenging folks on the narratives that they're internalizing and offering alternatives to show that, you know, there isn't just one way to be a guy. There's a lot of ways, and you have agency. I think that's another thing, is that masculine influencers actually are removing agency from the guys that they're peddling to, because they're creating such a narrow mold for them to fit.
Mhm.
And men have to give up a lot and sacrifice a lot to do that. And that's part of the narrative. And it's just not true. Like, you can do a lot of these things. You can, you know, you can get a pedicure. You can like have an emotional conversation. Then you can also like practice sports. You can do these traditional masculine things. There can be balance. There can be give and take. And so I think it's more just challenging any time that somebody's saying just do these three things, it's going to be oversimplifying. And when you point that out to people are like, yeah, that does make sense. You know, it's rare that you're going to like engage with somebody and be like, you really think doing three things every day is going to like get you to where you want to be? And so I think it's gently challenging, prodding, having conversation, and then also being like a resource, I think is part of that too, of like, you know, if somebody is struggling with fitness, like being like, hey, let's go to the gym together. Or, you know, like, hey, like here's some stuff that's worked for me. And so I think it's just being a good friend and not leaning away when somebody says they're engaging with that, but really trying to understand their motivations for what has led them to get there. And then seeing if that's something that you can have conversations around, help them with, and just create another source of fulfilling those needs that's not tied to those kind of harmful narratives around masculinity.
Well, as we often do, or every time actually, we end our program with a joy of the week, or joys if you've got several. I don't have one at the moment. Well, I do have one, but I feel like it's a cop-out. So Skip, I'm dumping it on you. What's your joy for the week?
So my joy for the week, you might see this little burn on the back of my hand. That's not the joy, but the joy is cooking. I recently bought for myself, for my birthday, I bought myself The Joy of Cooking, which is a cookbook that my dad had growing up. I always remember seeing it. I had no idea how massive this thing is. It's like 1,000 pages of really dense recipes. And me and my wife have just been picking things out. And, you know, there's a lot of things that, you know, I don't want to search around for something on the internet and everything. And I've been a little hesitant to do like a marinade or something like that. And it's just fun. We've been picking out stuff and doing recipes left and right. And it's kind of fun. And it's my joy. The joy of cooking is my joy. Yeah.
Okay.
I love that. Very apt.
Yeah.
Well, so my cop out is so I'll give you my first joy was in my head was that I've had about 7 days off from work, and I needed it. And now the joy is that I've recuperated. I feel healthy. I feel ready to go back to work, and I just feel good. And I just wasn't expecting that sort of like regeneration that is obvious to probably most people. But anyway, so that was joy. But what's eclipsing that is, and this is why it's kind of a cop out. I feel like I'm pandering, but I'm not. The joy is talking to you, Pete, about Movember, because it's so inspiring. It's so inspiring, and it feels good. And I this is the second time we've talked, and I've left the conversation just feeling hopeful and upbeat, and it's a real joy. I mean, I like I said, I don't mean to, you know, be pandering here, but that's how I feel, and it's a legitimate joy, and that's where I'm landing.
Thanks for that.
No need to squirm or anything. I'm just that's my joy. What about you, Pete? What have you got?
Well, I'm feeling very flattered, and feels like I'm doing my job right. If you're feeling motivated, well, and not like we're crushed under the expectations of what we're going to do next. But so that's great. Thank you. I'll say my joy. You know, I've had a busy month where I got engaged. We bought a house. We rented out our other house, and big life moves, big decisions happening. And there was a lot of work and logistics getting through it. But I had the experience just the other day of sitting on a couch in our backyard in the sun with my fiance, and we're eating breakfast burritos with our dog. And it was like just this perfect kind of vision of what life can be like now after we've done this big lift and had this big transition. And then it felt like we kind of have arrived in a little bit. And now we're able to enjoy it after, you know, all of the work that we did in the past month. And that was like a beautiful kind of shared experience that I would never have been able to do alone. And it's one of those beauties of like finding somebody you love and being able of partnership, of just having somebody where together you can do things that individually you never could, and including like having a very cool life that and you can build from together. And so I had that moment the other day, and I'm still kind of basking in that. So that's definitely giving me joy right now.
That's nice. That's
Awesome.
nice. That it reminds me. There's some person on Instagram that I frequently go back to, and Skip, I've sent it to you before. He posts like balloon messages on the wall on a wall, and you know what I'm talking about, Pete? Have you seen that?
I think I've seen one of those. Yeah.
So one message that I come back to often, and it's just a real reminder of to be grateful of what I have, and you reminded me of it with your joy. It is, remember how you felt when you wanted what you have right now. And it's just such a nice reminder, like, yeah, this thing that I have now, this place in life that I have now, and the where I'm at, I wanted that so badly previously, to where it was like painful before. You know what I mean? When you forget that after you've achieved it after so much time. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's a nice reminder. So I hope that you keep that in your in your mind as well, because these moments of joy are fleeting, but to stay grounded in them is fantastic.
I one of the questions that I've periodically, my wife and I ask each other is, because we've both had hard times in the past. We're just be like, can you imagine 10 years ago, like trying to explain to yourself where you're at now, and like, oh man, it's just like worlds better. Even with whatever's going on, that's how difficult. Like, this is so much better than it was. So like, yeah, it's same sentiment, different kind of like active question.
Thanks again, Pete. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we can schedule something in the near future and tackle more of the content from your the real face of men's health.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us. New podcasts every Wednesday. And if any part of this show has resonated with you, let us know at outsidethemanosphere@gmail.com. You can also reach us on Instagram, Facebook, and now YouTube. Please like, rate, subscribe to the podcast YouTube channel, or recommend us to a friend. We hope you'll come back. Have a good one.
Bye-bye now. Oh, dude. Wait, what is this? Is it a puzzle?
It's a pillow and comforter set.
Literally yesterday, I ordered 1,000-piece periodic table puzzle. That's so funny.
Yeah.
That's called a synchronicity, Skip.
Yeah, it is.